It's my pleasure to introduce you to Kinehild from the Kingdom of the West, who is teaching a class on Visigothic kingdoms of Iberia and France and a bit. Over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Kinehild, the library. I am up here in the opposite side of the Pacific Ocean from Lock. So I am in the Principality of Awertha, which is mundanely the state of Alaska. And I am going to be talking to you today about the Visigothic kingdoms of Iberia and sort of that general vicinity. Let me get my screen sharing set up so that we can all see the same thing. And like Gabriel said, please feel free. I can't see the chat when I'm talking. So please absolutely feel free. I like to have more of a conversation a lot of the time than just me lecturing to you for an hour. So interrupt. This is going to be some fairly complicated material, mostly because the sources that we're working from are very sort of fuzzy.
Will there be a handout?
So I am happy to share these slides with you. I did not have time to get a handout together. Let me actually back out of this really quick and I can get those for you. If you are wanting, let's see, copy, I want to change this. Yeah, got it. Okay, apparently I can't share this with other people. All right, I'll figure it out and post it to the event website. Is that okay?
When there's time, no rush.
All right. So who am I to be telling you all this stuff? Like I said, Kinehild. I am a nerd. Early Germanic history is my jam. My degree is in linguistics with a specialty in the history of English. And I have been excited about sort of Northern Europe before about the year 1000 since the 6th grade when one of my teachers did a unit on the Battle of Hastings. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. I have done some work with the Gothic language. Part of my laurel path was translating the Book of Luke from Gothic into English when I learned a lot about the Gothic language, which we won't actually be talking as much about in this presentation. But let me just tell you, the Ulfilas Bible is weird. Like it's fine, but it's also a little weird. I also like dogs. So there's a picture of me with a dog and I've got my contact information up there. I'm on Facebook. I use the email, very modern human. So feel free to shoot me a question, comments, feedback. If you think I did a terrible job, big girl, I can handle it. So let's talk about the background of the Goths. So I initially thought about starting this off as just like jumping straight into the Visigoths, but really that leaves a lot of information sort of floating, untied threads and ends. So we're going to do a little bit about how we get to the Visigoths, and then we're going to talk about the Visigoths. So who are the Goths? This is the first problematic question because the answer is really hard to know. The reason the answer is, excuse me, the reason it's a difficult question to answer is that the people who are talking about them don't speak their language and don't really know the answer themselves. So we've got Greeks and Romans writing about these people, and they're kind of like the Goths, the Gatones. The Greeks are forever just being like the Scythians. They're all Scythians. And you're like, no, they're not, but cool. So from working back through these sources and looking at archaeological evidence, what we've come up with is that they're probably a rough grouping of tribes united by their shared Eastern Germanic language. So Gothic is an Eastern Germanic language as compared to, for example, English, which is a Western Germanic language, or the various Scandinavian languages, which are Northern Germanic. They probably start coalescing around the 1st century BCE, though it's worth noting that this also corresponds with when Proto-Germanic begins separating out into these different groups. So in terms of like, at this point, could we call them the Goths? Probably not. They would have various individual names by which they knew their groups. Where did they come from? Another excellent question. Swedes will tell you it's Sweden every single time. They're like, yes, we have Gotland. We have Västergötland, right? Like these are all, they're the Goths. They come from Gotland. It makes sense, though that's a big question mark, maybe not. 6th century Roman scholar Jordanes, from whom we get a lot of our information about them, says that they came from the island of Skansa, which is generally understood to be Scandinavia, since he didn't realize that it was attached to the continent. He was like, it's an island. Archaeological evidence suggests that the wheelbark culture, which is an archaeological complex that shows up in kind of modern day Poland and then begins pushing south, that this may represent in archaeology the early Gothic peoples. However, it's important to understand that this wheelbark culture probably not purely Gothic, that you've got a conglomeration of different groups, including the Goths, the Gepids, and the Rugi. The Gepids are another Germanic group. The Rugi are, I believe, as well, but it gets real fuzzy at this point because, again, we're going back, we're talking about these Roman sources. The Romans are like, they're speaking a language that we don't understand, and it sounds real weird. So maybe it's the same, maybe it's not. If you look up a little earlier on the slide, it's got a little bit about the Eastern Germanic languages. This is one of those moments. So Vandal, the Vandalic people, the Vandals, very frustratingly, all we know about their language is like 3 sentences that are preserved in a Roman manuscript. So you've got this language that could be deeply fascinating. Like these languages tell us so much about how the Germanic languages developed because they were recorded so early. The recorded in the 4th century Gothic is, and it preserves all these language changes that would go on and happen later and affect the other Germanic languages. Or it kind of says like this Gothic never went through a couple of the changes. So that's how we know roughly when it split off from the others. Anyway, we could learn so much from Vandal, but only a little bit's preserved, and it's preserved by Romans who have no idea what they're writing down. So frustrating. Okay, so let's talk about the names of these people. You'll see most frequently Ostrogoth and Visigoth, but something fun to note, Visigoth is a word that I'm going to use throughout this presentation because it is the most commonly known term for this people, but they didn't call themselves Visigoths. So Cassiodorus, who is a Latin-speaking person in the court of the Ostrogothic kings of Italy, is like, well, you guys are the Ostrogoths. And Ostro, we understand to mean essentially Eastern. So we got to come up, what's the other Gothic? And well, they're to the west of us in Iberia and in France. So they're the Western Goths. So I hope I said to the west of us and not to the east of us. They're to the west of us. So I'm going to call them the Visigoths. But they eventually do adopt that name, but they didn't really call themselves that at that point. They adopt it because there's going to be a period of Ostrogothic dominion in the Visigothic kingdoms. And at that point, they're just like, well, whatever. But they probably called themselves Vessi or Erling, which is one of the early kings that leads them through. Alarian Goths is what you'll sometimes see, meaning that they're followers of Alaric. But so that's a whole moment that we can have about their name. Ostrogoth, also you'll see it spelled weird sometimes. Something though also to keep in mind is these tribal names are really, really fluid. So this is sort of like saying, like how do you define what a group of people are? You've got all these little smaller sort of clans within the broader tribe. One clan will come to power. It'll be one of the royal clans. So a great example of this are the Balthi. They come to power. So now is the entire tribe the Balthi Goths, or how does that work out? Scholars aren't entirely sure. All 3 of the books, the major sources that I used for this presentation, sort of disagree in their answers on this question. Very helpful that. Typically in historical documents, you will see Tervingi and Gretungi paired together. So you'll have them refer to the Tervingi and the Grethingi, or you'll see Vessi or Visigoth and Ostrogoth. There are, I think, 2 sources where all 4 names appear, but when all 4 names appear, you see them in the Tervingi, Vessi is first, and then Gretungi and Ostrogoths are second. This should not, however, be understood to mean that the Tervingi become the Vesti or the Visigoths and that the Greutungi become the Ostrogoths. It's a much more complicated question going on in there, but sort of the larger part of the Tervingi end up in the group that becomes the Visigoths, and the larger part of the Greutungi end up in the group that becomes the Ostrogoths. It is what it is. If you're curious, Tervingi, roughly people of the forest, Greutungi, roughly people of the steppes and pebbly coasts. I have not worked out how that quite gets from Greutungi, but smarter people than I have taken a swing at it, and that's what they came up with. So I will respect their authority. So how do we get from these people maybe leaving Scandinavia to the point where we've got the Visigoths coming into Europe? This is an incredibly simplified timeline. So first reference in written sources, we've got this guy Strabo who refers to the Butones, the Lugi, and the Semnones as part of a large group of people who come under the dominion of the Macromani. All of these people are Germanic peoples, and the Butones is generally understood to be essentially a typo for Gutones, which is the Goths. That's about 15 CE. Moving forward to about 150, we start to see the expansion of the Wilbart culture south towards the Black Sea, and this is generally understood to be roughly the time that the Goths began their sort of push south. Around about 200 CE is when the Romans and the Goths are like, you exist, and the Romans start hiring them on as mercenaries. The Goths get to the Black Sea and they discover boats. And they discover that boats are really quite fun. And they go for about a century, sort of harassing the Eastern Roman Empire. And they also learn the value of mounted warriors, which will come up later. So right about 375, 376, we have the arrival of the Huns, which kicks off a whole bunch of changes across Western Europe. One of the biggest is that the Goths, you have sort of a split. The Huns and the Goths meet, and we're going to talk about them more specifically here in a minute, but they're going to meet. Some of the Huns will manage to escape across the Danube towards Rome, and some of them will come under the sway of the Huns for a period before also making for Rome, making for Western Europe. And then there's a tiny little group that ends up staying in Crimea and becomes what are called the Crimean Goths, and may preserve a form of the Gothic language into the 15th or 16th century. But again, because the person recording it wasn't like a trained linguist, they were just somebody who's like, this is some weird words I heard. That's a bit of a question. So if you're curious why it says little daddy arrives, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent about Attila the Hun. So Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, right? He brings Western Europe to its knees repeatedly, forces the Eastern Roman Empire to pay him kilos and kilos and kilos, like 1,000 kilos of gold, right? So the question though is, where does the name Attila come from? Because names can teach us a lot. And one of the sort of older etymologies, this was an etymology first proposed by one of the brothers Grimm, is that it comes from an Eastern Germanic appellation for him, where Atta means like father, but it means informally father. And Ila is a diminutive. So you'll see another version of that in Ulfila or Ulfilas. Ila here meaning small or diminutive, right? So one translation of Attila's name is Little Daddy. And I think this is about the most outstanding bit of information I've learned in a while, and it amuses me, so now you know it too. It is worth noting though that etymology for his name it's possible, but it's not particularly well documented or well supported anymore, excuse me. So 376, the Huns have arrived. The Goths are like, this doesn't seem great. So they head for the Eastern Roman Empire. The Emperor Valens admits the Tervingi, who are fleeing the Huns, so this one particular group of the Goths, on the theory that they will make excellent farmers, which they have not yet proved that, but he seems to think it'll be good, and also excellent soldiers, and that they will protect Rome from other Goths. Spoilers, they do not. So he lets them in. The rest, more Goths follow pretty immediately after. Like basically they see the Tervingi get admitted and they're like, cool, let's go. So the Tervingi enter the Roman Empire under this really kind of unclear position. So they don't enter necessarily as foederati, which is like a higher level of official, it's not citizenship, but you get to come in and you get some rights, but you're obviously not a full citizen. But you get more rights than if you came in under some of the lower levels. So they come in, it's not clarified really well how, like what level of authority they receive. And then the local Romans begin just kind of making life hard for them. So they get really upset. And in about 378, we have the Battle of Adrianople, where mistreatment by these naughty Romans leads to angry Goths, and nobody wants angry Goths. And they decide to demand a redress of grievances. They march on basically anything they can get their hands on, and eventually meet the Emperor Valens and some Western forces as well at Adrianople, and they win a decisive victory. Valens dies. And this is seen by some as the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. Client state, thank you, Fleelish. Yeah, are they a full client state? Do they have those kind of rights? Or are they really just like kind of essentially slave labor or not quite slave labor, that's not quite right, but basically like you have to live in this crummy part of the world and you have to farm it and you have to pay us taxes and all this kind of stuff and provide us soldiers, and in return you get to live here basically. So as compared to a client state, which might have a little more say in their own lives, a little more local power, stuff like that. Thank you very much for this. I appreciate that. Yeah, taxation without representation. See how that works out? Make DC a state. Anyway, let's move on. Goths and the Huns. The Huns appear, as I said, about 375. They encounter first the Alans, which is an Iranian people in central, sort of northern Caucasus, Central Asia kind of area, and then the Goths who had settled around the lower Danube. One author put it, basically, the Huns hit the Alans, knocking the Alans westward. The Alans hit the Goths, knocking the Goths westward. But that doesn't really cover the entire picture, because while you have these sort of waves of folks coming in, so think about the ocean, right? You have waves coming in, but then there's like that undertow, right? That kind of pulls parts of it back. And it kind of does that. So you end up with Alans getting mixed in with the Goths. And so you end up with Hellenic and Gothic, sort of a little bit of commingling, but not entirely, because then later you've got the Alans as a separate group. And then you end up with some Goths and some Alans under the power of the Huns. And it, it's a mess. This whole history is it's hard to tell the difference. And so the Romans are all just sort of guessing, and we're stuck working off of their written records. Speaking of written records, we have the Aminius, who is the one who comes up with the idea that it's about 376 that the Goths begin their retreat westward. However, so begin is correct, but it's not quite the whole story, because we have settlement or not clear, but archaeological and historical evidence that suggests that you have independent Gothic habitation in the lower Danube as late as 400. So they didn't all, like 376, they didn't all just leave. So it may have been sort of, the traditional narrative is basically you have this wave of Goths that come over the Danube in one big push, or maybe two, right? But the reality seems to be that you had maybe one big group and then kind of little trickles and more trickles and more trickles, and that went that way. Ultimately, the Huns overwhelmed some of the Goths and some of the Gothic tribes who were incorporated into their empire, where others, as I mentioned multiple times now, went to Rome. There's also a number of battles between the two groups. And what's really kind of neat is that these battles, or at least the stories of these conflicts, are preserved in sagas of later Scandinavia. So if you have ever read Hervarar Saga of Heidreks, which is, if you watch Saga Saturday, it's one of the sagas we talked about. Within that, there's a poem called Hlöðskviða, which is a poetic legendary telling of a battle between the Huns and the Goths. And what's really interesting is you've got what may be a preservation of the original Germanic names of these two groups, the Greuthungi and the Tervingi. So you have the Grüting and the Tyrfing. And what's kind of fun is that ing ending typically signifies descendants of. So that would be like descendants of Grüt and descendants of Tyrf. Which raises a number of kind of fascinating questions about sort of historical or legendary figures, like who are these legendary people that they're descended from. It's also just a really neat poem. Attila also comes into Germanic legend. So if you've read the Volsung saga, you will remember the character of Atli. Atli in the Volsung saga is a version of Attila the Hun. So little bit of cross-contamination there, which I'm all for. Just to give folks kind of a geographical idea of where we're talking about and what's going on, you can see the Black Sea there. You can see the Alans and coming down in 375. The Huns are kind of making their way. They come in two groups. Some of them go south towards Cappadocia. Some of them, I think, actually go north. And then you've got the Goths kind of trying to escape. Some of them go to Antioch and to Constantinople, like, hey, we need some help. And the Romans are like, you can go here. It's fine-ish. It doesn't end up being fine. But just sort of general movements around 376 to 380. And this is from the book, The Goths by Peter Heather. Did we have a question? I see a thing. Does that mean that Ferengi means descendants of Ferin? You know, kind of, maybe. That's an interesting, I like that question. That is an outstanding question. You know, I think that's a research paper worthy kind of moment. Like, does it? What is the legendary origin of the Ferenginar and all this kind of good stuff? So we've talked about, you know, we've got the Goths from their big question mark homeland south to the Black Sea, and now they've crossed the Danube and they're entering Western Europe, but we still have to get them all the way across Europe to Iberia. How do they get there? So Valens allows the Tervingi, but not the Greuthungi into the Roman Empire. As was mentioned, the Greuthungi don't care, they come in anyway. You have these Gothic wars that ends in with the sort of, you get some commingling between the groups, and it ends with it's kind of a stalemate essentially. The Romans are sort of like, you guys fine, you can stay, but you really need to stop killing us. And the Goths are like, well, give us better land and make things a little nicer for us. So sort of what ends up happening, you end up with a group of Goths under Alaric I, moving west through the Balkans into Italy. He hits Rome in 410, conquers Rome, and then hits southern Gaul, finally into Spain. In 418, the Romans are like, look, there's this lovely bit of sort of southwestern France. It's gorgeous. How about you settle there and leave us alone? So again, we've got these maps. This one pushes us a little further west. We can see the Vandals are not the group we're talking about at all. The Ostrogoths are sort of the line dot, and then the Visigoths are red. It's really, at this point, who's an Ostrogoth and who's a Visigoth is still not super clear. You have mostly Goths following various kings, and they might have identified themselves that way. The use of certainly Greuthungi appears to have dropped out of circulation at this point. Tervingi, because it gets, they sort of get brought legally into the empire. Tervingi sticks around briefly as a legal designation under the Romans, but very quickly the Romans are just like, they're all Goths. They're just all loud and rude and not Roman, or not rude. We don't know. But the Romans certainly thought they were rude. So they eventually just, the Romans give up identifying who's who. And it's not until the Goths themselves start keeping records that we start to once again see identifications of which group is which, by which point they have dropped both Tervingi and Greuthungi, and they have picked up Ostrogoth, Visigoth designations. How far back Ostrogoth and Vesi go is another excellent question. Like I mentioned, there's at least one source that uses all four names. One theory that was raised about why those two names became the names that kind of they stick with is that Ostrogoth and Vesi, so Vesi means the noble, Ostrogoth means the Goths of the rising sun, right? So they're more boastful, more prideful than just these sort of geographic identifiers that Greutungi and Tervingi were. So that's one argument for why those two names survived. But again, they were not writing things down for themselves, so there's a lot of question marks. Which is essentially this entire lecture is, here's an idea, but it's probably just a question mark. So we do know though, pretty convincingly that the Goths were converted to Christianity, probably in the 4th century, largely through the efforts of a guy named Ulfilas or Wulfia. Wulfila is one version of his, is the sort of Germanicized version of his name, who was consecrated bishop in 341. We don't actually know much about Ulfilas's background or history. He may or may not have been Goth himself. He may have been somebody, there's one version of his story where he is a slave or born into bondage and sort of rises through and becomes a bishop. And what's very, very interesting here is Ulfilas preaches a theology that's originated by Arius, a bishop, or excuse me, a presbyter in Alexandria, who holds that Christ was not co-eternal with God the Father, and the Holy Spirit was not co-equal with God the Father and Jesus Christ. So for those of you who are Christian, most of us are Nicene Christians, or we proclaim the Nicene Creed. So you will note that this does not match that version of Christianity. And I've got here, this is Ulfilas's creed. That's the block of text there. And so this form of Christianity becomes known after its originating preacher, Arius, as Arian Christianity. Really quickly, I want to note, this is Arian, not Arian. So this has nothing to do with Iranian peoples or white supremacists. This is Arius Arian. I will try and pronounce it that way. I don't always succeed. So if I screw that up, I apologize. The Goths stick with Arianism even after the Council of Nicaea. So the Council of Nicaea is when they started to sort out, they don't actually manage to completely sort it out at that point, but they started to sort out that the creed, you know, I believe in one God the Father. If you like me grew up in the Anglican tradition, you'll remember having to stand there in the church while everybody in this moment that should be pretty joyful, just sort of droning, right? I believe in one God the Father. Anyway, it goes on from there. So Nicaea happens 321. The Goths don't care. And even after the conversion of Nicene Christianity by the Roman elite in about 378, the Goths are just like, nope, we're Arians. And they stick with that into Spain, into Iberia, and they stick with it well into the 5th century, which causes them a bit of a political problem because they're the only Arian Christians left in Western Europe. So everybody else is like, you don't believe what now? That's quite interesting. One of the things that I thought was kind of fascinating was one of the Constantines, when this was all getting debated, he considered this all essentially nonsense and didn't really care, whereas the theologians were like, look, guy, this is very important. And he's like, it's all Jesus, whatever. So I guess it's nice to be the emperor. So I'm hoping we have gotten to the Visigoths on the Iberian Peninsula. We're actually only halfway through our class lecture or our class time, and roughly halfway through our slides. So before I go on, I guess I'll stop, see if anybody's got questions on the history of the Goths. I know that went pretty quick for, 300 years of history. We want to talk about the Gothic language. Anybody there? Okay.
May as well go. I think you've answered all the questions that were raised during the time, so it's good.
Okay. I got a couple questions, a couple of somethings. Do we have time for language? Actually, yeah, Slithish, why don't we're probably going to end up speeding through the Visigoths too, because I'm still like that nervous person. So when we get to the end, we will talk about the Gothic language. We'll do a little, we'll do that. But let's get through the Visigoths first, and then we will get into the good stuff. So Visigoths 401 under Alaric, we kind of already covered this. The people who would become what we call the Visigoths today, they leave Illyria, which is the Balkans, break a treaty with Constantinople, which doesn't matter anyway, because the guy that they made the treaty with is dead, and they head for Italy. Initial conquest fails, so they make this break into Italy, but it doesn't work out. And Alaric, though, is like, you know what? That looks like nice country there. And it's certainly nicer than where we came from. So let's try this again. By 408, they laid siege to Rome. By 410, they enter the Eternal City. Unfortunately, though, at the same year, Alaric dies. And so this is going to be, and then the king died, is going to be kind of a refrain we hear a lot. And then the king died, question mark, ... is going to be the problem of the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse and it's not the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, it's the Visigothic kingdom of somewhere else that I've just completely blanked on the name of. It's a place in France.
Aquitania.
Aquitania, yes. And Toulouse is in France too. So anyway, doesn't matter. So this is going to be a continuing problem. Romans eventually decide that maybe Gaul would be a nice place for Goths. They marry off Alaric's brother-in-law, Ataulf, who was clearly married to somebody else Alaric was married to his sister. They marry Ataulf off to Galla Placidia, who is a widow of a Roman emperor, if I remember correctly, or the sister of a Roman emperor, in about 414, and send the Goths to the Aquitaine. But then Ataulf dies, kicking off a bit of a succession crisis. So what's important to note here is that the Goths don't practice heritable kingship. So much like the early Anglo-Saxons, Utes, that early English milieu, they practice a elective kingship. So there are certain qualifications you have to meet to be considered for kingship. So you have to be part of this broader royal clan. But beyond that, it's a little bit like you just sort of vote for your favorite, and it's the nobility and later the church that's going to play a role in selecting who the king is. This does not make the most stable governmental structure. We'll just leave it at that for now. So they send them off. The Roman military, however, at this point is undergoing some pretty significant shifts and changes. So they're ending up leaning more and more heavily on these quote unquote barbarian foederati, which is what the Goths have become, to fill out and to take the place of what had been the job of the Roman legions. So the Goths keep getting sort of sent, the Gothic armies keep getting sent various places. And they, in this time, they're making significant improvements. They have picked up from some Ostrogoths that they met at one point who had picked it up from the Huns, the importance of cavalry and stirrups and these kind of good things. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, they might not have stirrups, but cavalry has been discovered to be a very, very important moment. So their cavalry is getting better and better to the point where the Alans, who are one of these sort of great horse cultures and who had been brought in by the Romans to be these heavy cavalry units, the Gothic cavalry is getting to be at least as good as, if not better than, the Hellenic cavalry units, which is when the Goths and the Romans fight, which doesn't happen infrequently, is beginning to be a problem for the Romans. So they're doing their best to keep, because if they can keep the Goths occupied elsewhere and keep their armies off and doing things for the Roman Empire that'll get them paid, then they're less likely to harass the Romans themselves. This is their vision for the world. So they start in 418, they start sending them into what becomes Spain, into the Iberian Peninsula, to put down the Vandals who have come up through Northern Africa. And this group that they refer to as the Bagaudai, which they're never super clear, but it's probably a local sort of brigand population probably Romance speaking groups of people, not necessarily like a tribal thing, but this is just people who were starving because the Romans weren't great at taking care of Hispania at this point. Probably people who are angry at the various leaders that have come and gone, angry at the Vandals, take your pick. So they're sort of harassing the Romans. The Romans are like, look, Goths, come do your thing. So they get introduced to Iberia, and they think it's rather lovely. They move their power center to Toulouse in modern day France, which I have spelled wrong here. Towards the end of the 15th century, the Western Roman Empire it's collapsing. Sorry, guys. And it becomes closer. It's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So they are focused less and less and less on kind of keeping the Goths organized and doing what they want them to do, and frankly less focused on keeping Gaul organized and doing what it wants to do. So they're just basically like, southern France, Goths go wild, keep it under control. It's cool. By 474, the Goths held the Provence and the Auvergne, in addition to their original holdings in Aquitania. And Roman chronicles set the first settlement in what would become Spain in 497. So we've got a kingdom set up at this point. Again, still an elective kingship. We're going through kings at a bit of a clip. Kings are frequently murdered. One of them, there was a comment in one of the books that a king died of natural causes in, I want to say like 510, which was the first time that had happened since 408. So kings are just, it's a difficult job that it turns out a lot of people want to do, but a lot of other people want to do it too. So then we get to sort of this Gothic superstate. And this is where we start to see ties between the Ostrogoths, who at this point have gotten quite comfortable in Italy, and the Visigoths. You start to see diplomatic ties and marriage alliances going back and forward. And you've got the Franks as a rising power. So 507, the Franks and the Visigoths meet at Vouilly, and that basically stops Visigothic expansion that direction. So the Franks win and push that center of power away from Toulouse, and they're starting to push it into Iberia to Toledo. So like I mentioned, we've got this intermarriage and diplomatic communication between the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, ensuring the sort of Gothic hegemony between Iberia, across the south of France to Italy. At this point, also, Visigothic power is starting to ebb a little bit. We've got a rapid succession of kings, which is ask the Scots, right? It never works out well. So the Ostrogoths, at this point, they sort of create this overlordship for a period. There will be basically tribute paid by the Visigoths to the Ostrogoths in Italy until about 523. As I've mentioned before, there's that religious conflict between the Arian Gothic elite and the Nicene Roman population. It expresses itself in a number of ways, up to and including Arian churches trying to go through the king of the Visigoths to get control of various artifacts, which the Nicene Christians don't want to give up. So they go to the king, oh, king, and the king's like, I can't actually force them to, sorry guys. So they go through a period where they try and get these two very distinct forms of Christianity to come into line. We have, I think there's 16 councils of Toledo all told. Often kings get selected at councils of Toledo, so it's not always a religious thing. But at one of them, the third council of Toledo is when they abandon it fully, but they do go through a period prior to that where they're trying to, modify Arian beliefs and Arian theology to get it more in line with Nicene Christianity without going all the way. And it's in that period between when they start trying to modify the theology and when they give it up entirely that we start to see some major Gothic rebellions by other members of the royal clan who are basically saying, look, I'm not entirely convinced that this was because of the religious faith thing and not a case of just, this is our power and you're frittering away our power and giving too much of it to these Nicene bishops, and not to the people who we have historically been allied with. So I don't know, again, if that's a religious, if there really was that much of a difference in religious practice. And if you went to sort of your local Gothic nobleman, if he could really explain to you the difference between Nicene and Arian Christianity, it's very unclear the level of learning, because there's not generally a whole lot of literacy at this point outside of religious institutions. We do, though, go through a period where we have parallel structures, though it's difficult to say, as I mentioned, how different religion worship really was. An Arian, as I mentioned, 589, Third Council of Toledo, they finally say, look, guys, we're getting rid of this Arianism thing, and we're just all going to be Nicene Christians. The king who had been in place just prior to this, Leovigild, who had been, I think he might have actually been the one who died of natural causes. His records of his reign suggest that he was leaning that way anyway before his death. But then after his death, it was a safe way to unify the kingdom and just finally put to rest some of these little spats that would pop up between Arian Christians and Nicene Christians, especially between the two churches, over power, over wealth, over land, all that kind of good stuff. Gothic kings don't die easy, is that last point. So let's move on to kind of the end, moving towards the end of the kingdom. We have what's called the Visigothic Twilight, or what I've called the Visigothic Twilight. Let's not make that an academic term. As it turns out, if you have lots of this political infighting and assassination and other oopsies, deaths of kings, that doesn't actually make for a terribly stable state. And when you are, for example, faced with even small invasions by other groups, things can fall apart really quickly. So one way that you could support a kingdom with an elective monarchy is to have a very strong group of noblemen. Unfortunately, Visigothic law allows the king at any point, if you are associated with somebody who has led or who has participated in a rebellion, which was happening all the time, as it turns out, the king could take your land and keep it for himself and then either redistribute it or not. Sorry about that. And then exile you. So his nobility, the nobility of the Visigothic kingdom are constantly going through these periods where like a family's wealth would get stripped from them, they'd get exiled, maybe the next king would let them back in, maybe not. And maybe they'd get their land or their power back, maybe not. So you're constantly playing this sort of delicate political dance of, we've got an elected king, but it looks like maybe he's going to get murdered next Tuesday. So what do we do about that? If we stop it, that's good, but what if we don't actually successfully stop it, right? Like just all this kind of stuff going on. So instead, where you could have had kind of a delicate balance at the top, but then a strong foundation, what ends up happening is you have this very weak foundation, a very delicate top, and so things get quite complicated. In the late 7th century, we have a king, Egica, who attempts to make his son co-ruler. And this, I don't believe this is actually the first time, but this is the first time it really goes wrong, because the nobility at this point, they're irritated and they're like, look, that's not how elective kingship works. You don't get to keep power within your immediate family. When you die, there's going to be somebody elected king. And typically, if there was going to be a co-ruler, which I think does happen a number of times, it's going to be a co-ruler who's like adopted into the family from another, like kind of, or just somebody else who's like, you're my co-ruler now. And that's basically like, you're vice president when I croak. However, and so that doesn't work out well. Egica gets killed. Witiza is another king not long after. He makes the whole situation worse by dying again. right about the time when there's not particularly anybody good to take over for him. And also right about the same time as we start to see these Arabic expeditionary forces entering from North Africa, kind of eyeing land in Europe. So he dies in 710. By 712, Toledo had fallen, and Ruderick, who's the guy who ends up inheriting the Visigothic throne after his death, is also dead. So Ruderick, short life. But there's a lot of question about how you had this. It wasn't super stable, but it was, it stuck around for a few hundred years, which was pretty impressive in those days. Kingdom that just falls apart under what isn't really a lot of, it's not huge armies that are coming across from North Africa. So the answer seems to be that basically there had been so much instability among the nobles and among the Visigothic inheritance of the kingship, that by the time it just the Arabs hit them at just the right moment, just the perfect weak moment, and they could not get everybody together fast enough to put together a proper defense. So it ends up collapsing pretty quickly. 2 years between the death of Witiza and the death of Ruderick and the fall of Toledo, which is really rather quickly. So we're going to talk a little bit about things like government structure, religion, which we've actually mentioned a number of times, and then why this is all so confusing. And then that'll be the end of the stuff I have on the Visigoths, which I apologize for those of you. I meant to start off by saying that I apologize. I had a vision for like a really in-depth class on the Visigoths, and then I just work-life balance stuff didn't work out as well as I was hoping it would. So governmental structure.
There's 13 minutes left on the
13 minutes
class
left. Thank you very much.
Before the hour. And we will need to finish a couple minutes early to allow for the swap over.
Awesome. Flithish, you asked who is in Iberia before the Visigoths get there. You've got Romans. I think there's some Vandals running around. And then you've got just sort of the local population that has been sort of there. I think there's some Celts up north. I think there's another class that actually answers that question, because that's the best answer I've got. So governmental structure, written law codes preserve the primacy of the king. We have, as I mentioned, an elective monarchy. By the 7th century, there's this sort of Senate. And if you could get this group of court nobility together to focus, they could wield some pretty significant power. But getting them all organized and direct and focused was pretty challenging, because a lot of the power that they were wielding was electing the next king. And they all wanted that king to be elected from their family. So yes, sorry, Michelle, thank you. The Basques. I honestly don't know a lot about the history of Iberia prior. Mara, let me get through this stuff, and then I'll hit language stuff at the end, if that's all right. Oop, that's the wrong thing. Early relationship between the kings of the Visigoths and the Romans, client kingship versus independent kingdom. That's pretty murky. We're still not entirely sure what the answer is. And then again, the relationship between the original inhabitants of Iberia and Aquitania and the Goths. It's very likely that there was not enough Goths. Basically, Spain still speaks a Romance language, so there's no evidence that there was enough Goths to come in and basically squash the local culture. So they probably came in, there was enough to act as sort of a political elite, but it never really percolates all the way down, affecting sort of the locals and what they're speaking to each other. And before somebody asks, I don't know if there are any traces of the Gothic language in Spanish today, mostly because I just don't know a lot about Spanish. Religion, like I mentioned, by the time they get to Iberia, they're all Christian, but they're just not the same kind of Christian as the locals. Conversion to Nicene Christianity is as much a political decision as it is a religious function. This is just a way to unite everybody. And now, problem of sources in archaeology. First off, sources are lost and destroyed. There was famously a surviving copy of a a complete record of the councils of Toledo that was destroyed in the first year of the Spanish Civil War. So that's not that long ago. You know, historically speaking, and so we had this written documentation that's gone now, and unlike you know, some of the other manuscripts that have been lost to us, nobody took a record of it. Some sources are confused. You've got a very tumultuous time in history. You've got a lot of primary participants who don't write, so they're not writing their own histories. Those histories are being written for them or about them by folks who maybe don't quite understand the nuances of what all's going on. Also, a lot of the time they're writing it well after the events that have occurred, especially when we talk about the migration period. That's sort of a hot mess source-wise. So events aren't necessarily recorded clearly or in the right chronological order. There's a number of, for example, king lists of the Visigothic kingdoms where the king lists get real murky in the middle, and they're not entirely sure because kings are dying and new ones are coming in, and there's these interregnums as people are getting elected. Not helpful. Archaeology, you would think, okay, cool, archaeology will help us out here. So a lot of the archaeology was done in the 1920s and 1930s, which was classically a very stable time in Europe, right? So records were not particularly well maintained, and finds were very mixed together in museums and private collections. So rather than saying, you know, this is all from this grave, like today we can go to the Swedish National Museum's website and we can say, you know, I want to see Birka grave number 321, and you can look at exactly what was found in that grave. We can't do that with the Visigothic finds. And more frustratingly, because at this point they have been Christian for a while, grave goods do not seem to be as big a deal as they were with a lot of the other Germanic populations. So there's roughly, one of the studies that I was reading, there's 285 recorded Visigothic graves. Of those 285 of them, 195 have no grave goods of any type. That word should have been sort, not sorry. So no grave goods at all. And then from there you get, like, when you do get grave goods, it might be like a couple of buckles or just small sets of finds. So when you start to do things like interpret clothing, you're really working through this very question mark space. What do we know about them? How much, for example, how much Roman dress, Roman affectation did they adopt, or did they not adopt any? Like, if they're clinging to their Arian Christianity, is that indicative of the fact that maybe they clung to their traditional dress or their traditional whatever for longer than maybe other, like the Franks, right? The Franks see the Byzantines and they're like, that we're doing that, right? So it's a big question mark, and it's very frustrating because this is a very fascinating moment in history that we just don't know nearly enough about. So there's that. And then here's my very favorite factoid. This is a medieval factoid much after the period. In 1434, the Bishop of Vaxo gave a speech at the Council of Basel where he argued that the Swedish monarch, Eric of Pomerania, was a successor of the Gothic kings, and that the Swedish delegation therefore deserved a senior rank because the Goths had converted so early. In response, Bishop Alfonso of Burgos claimed seniority and those choice seats on the basis that he represented the ancient Visigothically founded monarchy in Spain, and moreover, the Visigoths of Spain were more Gothy Goths than the any Goths that may have stayed in Sweden, because the ones who stayed in Sweden didn't do anything interesting, but the ones who went to Iberia, went to Spain, you know, they conquered kingdoms and they got out and they did proper Gothic things. So that's just a bit of deep humor for you. At least what I find funny. So let's talk about language really quick. Gabriel, how much time do I have?
Unfortunately, it's 5 minutes to the hour, and the next class is scheduled to start at 1. What I was going to suggest is that there is actually, there's a breakout room. There's another room on this that can flow through to those people who are interested. So at this point, we'll end it there. Do you want to have some closing words?
Thank you all very, very much for coming. I hope I only confused you a little bit. And that I have got you guys to maybe look more into this. If you want to read a good history of the Goths, The best history that I have ever read of them is this one. It's called A History of the Goths, and it's by a guy named Herwig Wolfram. It was originally published in German, but it's been translated into English. This is the most complete history of the Gothic people that I have found. And then there's another good one, Visigothic Spain, which was by Roger Collins. This is the one that I was frantically trying to finish in time for this class. So those are the two I'd recommend to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop the recording now.